Started. As I stated in the chat earlier, I will have at the very end of this presentation a Q&A session, and that won't be recorded. I want a ground rule that it will be a safe space. There'll be no such thing as a daft or a silly question. The worst thing is I can say I don't know, but I want people to feel that there's confidence that you might have a nagging feeling, oh, that's a bit daft or I'm not quite sure. Don't worry. Worst thing I can do is say I'm not sure. I would also like us to take a moment to appreciate the work of colleague Kirsty Jepson for facilitating this event on such short notice after the previous organisers, for whatever reason, decided to withdraw the previous Lunch and Learn booking. So I don't know if you use the React button or whatever it is, virtual clapping, haha. So what have you, or thumbs up or whatever you choose. I would like to ask that people to please keep muted until the Q&A bit is on. And just checking, you can still see the slides, you can still see me. Brilliant, I see lots of nods. So we'll begin. So I'll give you a bit of my background. So I've had, give or take, 15 years in what I call autism advocacy, speaking to schools, businesses, local NHS trusts, to where I used to live in the Lake District. I worked with the government of the time in a review of the Autism Act, worked with Manchester University on autism research, in which I had little electrodes and stuff plugged to my head, which was very interesting. I've spoken to local and national media about autism and related topics recently on Radio 4's You and Yours program about mate crime, and which is a crime perpetrated in particular against autistic people, and have certification from the University of Kent and the National Autistic Society. So I try and keep busy. So autism, neurodiverse conditions are considered a hidden disability. And I bring this up, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, I suppose, but it's important that everyone remembers not every disability is immediately visible. When we see disability, we generally think of the wheelchair symbol. It's used for disabled parking spaces, things like that. So neurodiversity and autism fall within that category. Now, the autism spectrum, things, conditions such as Asperger syndrome, or autism, are all part of the autistic spectrum. And what it means is that every single person you come across who has autism or is autistic aren't going to be the same. There isn't a every autistic person is X, Y, and Z. Just like everybody else, one person's favorite color is red, another person's favorite color is blue. You're going to find that autism impacts people very differently. And I'll just bring this up as a side note. One of the reasons, there are two reasons Asperger syndrome isn't used much as a term anymore, in part because the diagnostic manual changed in America and now in Europe, and in part because the gentleman who discovered Asperger syndrome, Hans Asperger, it came out that his work on children during 1940s Germany may not have been consensual. I'll say no further. So there go, that name's been kind of stripped. So you still hear it, but you won't hear it as much as you did, say, 10 years ago. So I'm going to quickly go over how autism impacts people. Then I'm going to give a few of my life experiences, which is just basically you all get to have a good laugh at my expense. And then we'll go on to how we can relate and other things. So one of the things that people with autism tend to rely on is routine. Dependent on routine and time management, may not cope well with change. So whether that's knowing that you're starting work between 9 and 5, whether you know that your train's going to be at 9 o'clock, and if that's delayed, how it can then impact the rest of the day, and understanding that either from a employee or management perspective that is very critical, and also to provide context to when change happens, because it's not as if autistic people can't process change, but we need maybe extra support or extra context to understand said change. The next is interests. I'm sure we can all think of examples where there's been in the news, maybe, or on newspapers or what have you, a story of an autistic person who you can tell them a date from 1942 and they can tell you what day it was just by the date, or they could do a lot of different things that to everyday Joe seem incredible pieces uh, of intelligence, and it can lead to expertise in subject areas. But there, with the positive, there are also some negatives implied with that. So one thing that's not well known when it comes to greater society is the impact autism has on the senses. So you've got sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. And what it means is that each of those senses can be hypersensitive or undersensitive, or whatever the correct term may be. So, for instance, these glasses I'm wearing, they're not prescription glasses, but they help take the edge off of bright lights and blue light and things like that. So I can work well in, say, a brightly lit office when I'm on site or when I'm at home looking at the computer screen. Hearing as well, maybe you hear a needle drop. I don't know if you've heard that kind of expression, but take all of those senses and you can think of an example of it being either a heightened sensitivity or a lowered sensitivity. This has led to a lot of cases in youngsters in particular of being found to potentially have eating disorders or picky diets, but it's not necessarily one of those conditions. It's just that their autism has the sensory overload has made it so that, say, a certain texture or taste of food is registered as a threat to the brain. It may seem illogical, but if something's detected as a threat to the brain, there's not much else you can do about it. But I'll come into that in due course. So communication differences. This one's a big one. So autistic people do not inherently have the autonomous response that most people have to social interaction. And it takes a cognitive mental toll to be able to interact with people. So whereas you might look at somebody and think, oh, they're sad, or they're a bit angry, or they're a bit depressed because they're slumped, autistic people, and I speak for myself in this situation, we have to really concentrate and think, okay, they've got this facial expression, their slump, what's their communication style? Oh, they've just raised their voice. Have I said something wrong? So all of this time we are manually translating what's being said and done, which is mentally and physically exhausting and draining. An autistic person may exhibit strange nonverbal behavior. So I'm sure we've all heard, if you want to make a good impression in an interview, you sit upright, you give eye contact, and you look as if you're paying attention, whereas potentially I might not give eye contact, and not out of being impolite, but going back to what was mentioned there with the sensory aspect, me giving you eye contact to me might trigger the same response as if somebody rubbed chlorine in my eyes. Not exactly pleasant. Could misunderstand common phrases, things like sarcasm. I don't know whether it's because I was a child or whether it's because of the autism, but I remember as a child being in absolute distress during school, and it was because one of the teachers says, oh, it's raining cats and dogs, and I was distressed because I wanted to go out and save the cats and dogs from falling from the sky. So one thing that I remember in the 90s when I was very young, reading back on this, was things can be very black and white, yes or no. There are no room for shades of grey, which, as I'm sure we can all appreciate, there's a lot of nuance in the world we live in. So, for example, there was a young lady who, I think it was in the Midlands, this was going back in the 90s, autism wasn't really as well known, had mental health issues, and one of the doctors asked this patient, can you hear voices? Now, taking the literal interpretation of that question, well, of course they could hear voices. There's nothing wrong with their hearing. Instead of Can you hear voices of people who aren't speaking or people who aren't there? Now, this led to this patient getting medication that wasn't appropriate, and eventually it was sorted out. But I hope that example can highlight where things can go a bit, for lack of a better word, things can go a bit wrong. Other impacts. So the first one is I mentioned the mental and physical drain and distress that these items together can bring together. So I'll run through a bit of a scenario for you. You're working in an office, the lights are blinding you because of the sensory impact. It's stinging your eyes. You've just had a chat with one of your colleagues who got upset with you because you didn't seem to show emotion at something they told you, and a lot of other scenarios can lead to one of two reactions in some circumstances called meltdowns or shutdowns. A meltdown is a very extrovert or very outward reaction. Um, in young children, it can be mistaken as having a temper tantrum or a fit or whatever you want to call it. And shutdowns is the inverse of that, inward. So becoming shut off from the rest of the world, effectively cutting yourself away and isolating oneself. And all this leads to a higher percentage of autistic people, myself included in this, who become diagnosed with other mental health conditions such as clinical depression, anxiety, and so on. When it comes to some other stats, autistic people have 16 years less life expectancy than non-autistic people, which that's fun to read. But when it comes to the actual prevalence, when I was diagnosed in the mid 90s, it was roughly 1 in 1,000 people. Nowadays, that could be as much as 1 in 60 people, though a few weeks ago I heard it could be as much as 1 in 20. As we learn more about the condition and better diagnosing people, we find out there are more autistic people in society. Out of that, it's about 3 in 4 a male and 1 in 4 female. And there are two routes of thinking behind why this is. One is that the male brain is just more perceptive to become autistic, and the other is, and this is the one I buy in, that the majority of autism-based research over the last many decades has been focused primarily on boys and men, and nowhere near as much as on women. So I believe that's why the factors are skewed in that way. When it comes to work, there are some barriers to entry for autistic people. So welfare reforms of the 2010s meant that 30% of autistic people received less financial or social support. So being denied, say, the disability benefit means they weren't able to access the disability support at their job centre, for example. And one thing I want to be known is that psychometric assessments that a lot of employers are now going to use as a model have been found by employment tribunals that they discriminated against autistic people in the recruitment process because of the way that autistic brains, forgive me if this is the wrong term, but the neurology, the way the autistic brain is essentially wired, it goes against that completely. And yet, with there being 2 or 3 employment tribunal cases where an autistic person took an prospective employer to court and won, many autistic people are still shut out of recruitment because of the psychometrics assessments. About 16% of autistic adults are in full-time employment. 53% are seeking work, with 10% of those receiving support to find work, which shows the disparity. With 22% of overall autistic adults being in paid employment compared to 80% being in paid employment who aren't autistic. So there's a big bridge societally, but that's for the people in charge to figure out. Reasonable adjustment I want to raise, because when people hear the term reasonable adjustment, perhaps unintentionally or unconsciously may think, oh no, it's going to take forever and it's going to cost a fortune to do these things. What it may be is just a case of sitting down and having a discussion about things. For example, as I mentioned, I wear these glasses, no cost to the NHS because I already own them. Another example would be one of my colleagues from the Dawn network wears noise cancelling headphones when in an open office so that they aren't sensory overloaded by the amount of conversations going around the office. And there may be software on the company portal or software center, such as read and write, already on the machines, that can help, again, of no extra cost or time constraint. So it's worth having those types of conversations. So I want to go over some myth busting very quickly. Number one, can I catch it? No, you can't catch autism. It's theorized at the moment that it's hereditary in families, so perhaps a parent will pass on to a child, but again, that's a theory as I understand it at the moment. The next one's a fairly controversial one, the vaccines cause autism thing, which Andrew Wakefield, who originally perpetrated this story, was stricken off the medical register. Hundreds of peer-reviewed studies through countries throughout the world have proven no correlation, which has sadly meant that conditions such as measles and mumps have returned and in places of the world where it was once eradicated. I will share a quick story that during the coronavirus pandemic, I got my COVID jabs, and a loose friend of the family told me that it would give me autism. I explained that I'm already autistic, to which they told me I would get super autism. I've yet to figure out what super autism is, although I like to think in my mind it just means that I'm on a reserve bench for the Avengers or the Justice League, but whatever. Next was no empathy. Now, this is quite an important one because some autistic people, we struggle to convey how we feel, and it goes back to that cognitive piece I was talking about before. We can become exhausted talking to people, quote unquote, normally, and aren't sure how we convey if we're sad, if we're happy, and we have to do all this manually. It's a bit like trying to speak in a second language. You may understand a bit of it, but it's not your native tongue. It's led to what's been called the double empathy problem, where autistic people feel empathy to the people they're speaking to, but because they can't convey how they're feeling, they feel almost double the guilt, double the remorse, which leads into the mental health item I raised before. Now, how can we relate? It's all well me coming on this lunch and learn session and talking, and then you going away and going, oh, that was interesting, but how do I figure this out outside of this session? So there are some famous figures who are on the autism spectrum. We've got the likes of Susan Boyle, who was the famous artist who came out of the Britain's Got Talent fame, and Anne Hegarty, who is one of the chasers of the Chase quiz show, very intelligent woman. We've got Tim Burton, whose films are very unique and arguably made Batman cool again. And then we've got, forgive me, I will butcher the pronunciation, Satoshi Tajiri, who is the gentleman who created a franchise known as Pokemon, which is worth several $billions. Next, I want to recommend a few books and TV shows and what have you. So, House Rules by Jodi Picoult. Again, apologies for pronunciation problems. Very interesting book set where a youngster with autism is accused of murder, and when interrogated, he doesn't give eye contact. Of course, that's because he's guilty and he has a guilty conscience. Or is it because of the way his autism presents and he doesn't give eye contact, guilty or not? Raises a lot of interesting questions. Next one is Lives with Autism by Steve Mee, a doctor from University of Cumbria. Myself and other autistic people contributed chapters to this book, so each chapter or section you read is a different take on life. And then another one is All Cats Are on the Autism Spectrum by Kathy Hootman. I wish this book existed when I was younger. Each page has a picture of a cat and it gives a kind of an autistic behavior or stereotype or what have you, and relates it to that animal. And it's a really friendly, easy way of looking at autism. I will also say she has another book called All Birds Have Anxiety and All Dogs Have ADHD. And it just puts a really friendly spin on things because a lot of people will know people with pets or have pets themselves. When it comes to TV shows, I believe it's a Scandinavian crime drama called The Bridge, where the gender roles of the leads are somewhat reversed, and I won't spoil it, but if you're into kind of crime dramas, it's a good show to watch. The A Word, which was about a youngster being diagnosed with autism on the BBC, and how it impacted the family and the generation divide. And then Doc Martin, a series about a GP. He's not officially classified as being autistic in the show, but when the creators were interviewed, they said it was it was kind of a unwritten cue that the character of Doc Martin was on the autism spectrum. Now we're going to get into the personal story. So this is the bit where you all get to have a bit of a laugh at my expense. So, the invisible toolbox. Now, the sad thing about this being remote is normally if I was stood up in a podium or something, I'd be running about and doing all the kind of hand gestures and so on, but I'll do my best. So in secondary school, high school, myself and about 4 or 5 other young lads, 15, 16 years old, we had a special educational needs department at school, and they brought in a expert to help us become more sociable with our peers. Now, to us being 15, 16-year-olds, that meant 3 things. 1, how do we get on with the lads? 2, how do we approach men or women who we find attractive for relationships? And 3, what's the point of this thing they call football? Now, I want you to imagine you're the panel, the young people, and I'm going to come in and approach you as 15, 16-year-old people. So, hello, everyone. How are we all doing today? Isn't this just the most marvelous day of the year? It's so pretty out. Now, I want you to pay close attention. Ooh, did you see what I just did there? You there, did you see what I just did? Did you? Did you see what I just did? I just put on the table the invisible toolbox, and we will use it to fix our emotions. Now, myself and my friends at this point, it's not side-eyeing each other, it's kind of a whole head turn, like, what the heck's going on here? So, goes through it all, and at the end, they asked for feedback. So, me being me at the time, I was a very different person. I just bluntly said, you realise if I use this in the real world, I'll look like a real spanner and not an invisible one. Everybody else laughed, and I was told to get out and never come back. Now, that wasn't necessarily a case of malicious intent. I think it was, if that advice had been given to primary school kids, I'm sure that would have gone down well. But maybe not appropriate for people who are of the age that they could join the army. Maybe, if they were so inclined. Well, technically we can't because we're autistic, but you get the idea. We're up that age group where, Anywho, it's actually what inspired me to get into this advocacy work in the first place. The next one. Does anyone have any questions? Now, I mentioned about the black and white interpretation on the world and things of that nature. So many moons ago, I was an apprentice at a local authority, and on my second day of my apprenticeship, we were summoned to the head of the council, and they were talking about digitizing a load of things, and this was around the time of the austerity budgets, and they were going to shut down a lot of local offices and consolidate them into hot desking things. So I then, being a bit of an IT geek, said, okay, what kind of encryption is this new IT system going to use? To which the salesman from this external company said, what's that? And I kind of went off on one of my interests and said, well, if you don't have encryption, this is going to be a problem because somebody from China could, or somebody from Russia or from America, anywhere in the world could potentially breach the system, steal this information, and masking their IP address, you'd never know who they were. To which they then said, what's an IP address? And somebody senior just kind of ushered me to be quiet. There was then another question on accessibility. So I mentioned consolidating lots of big offices into smaller, hot desking. So I then asked about myself and my colleagues, one of whom was deaf with hearing aids. And I said, how is my colleague going to work in an open office where their hearing aids get interference from lots of background noise and so on and so on? And they hadn't, as it came out later, hadn't taken accessibility into consideration when making this move. Now, you could say it was a negative point on me for not understanding the nuances of office politicking and not knowing my place, or whatever term you want to use. But I think it's important maybe having that person there to say, hang on a minute, what about this, that, and the other? But I'll leave that up to your interpretation. Now, the next one's a personal story from me, and apologies if it's tough, because it's yeah, in 2013, 2014, I was in the health and social care sector, and I thought, this is it, this is my career, I found my calling. And 6 months into the role, we were told that we would be off probation and given, I think, an extra 20p an hour, for instance. And throughout the time, did performance reviews, and you get excellent, good, average, poor, and I forget what the fifth one was, but you get the idea. And I ranked good throughout. Anyway, my pay packet didn't go up, and I asked my direct manager, and they said, "Oh, it's because of the challenges you find when speaking to clients and colleagues." And I asked why, this hasn't been raised in any kind of performance review, etc. What are you talking about? And the gist of the conversation, as I picked up, was, well, your difficulties mean that we have extended your probation period without your consent. It was a very big problem. And after a month or two of trying to do the office politicking, I wrote a nice letter to the CEO and got backdated pay within 3 days. But I've no doubt that this happens all over the place. Sorry, everyone. Just anyway, moving on. Another one, my school time. Are you sure it's not just banter? Now, this is a pretty one because being in school, I was the victim of bullying quite a lot, and was told, are you sure it wasn't just them being banterous? Are you sure it wasn't just, it's just character building and things of that nature, which I would then say, I don't think it was characteristic. Bob just punched me in the face, but okay, or whatever. And my dad raised me a bit old-fashionedly. He would say, if somebody's giving you grief, son, he'd say, ask them to stop, tell them to stop, and then make them stop, kind of 3 strikes. So occasionally I would also get punished for being, standing up for myself. But the punishments weren't punishments. So let me give an example. So in my school, detention, you were taken out of the main hall, which had bright lights and smells of all the different concoctions of different things people brought in, and all the loud noise, and which was torturous and everything else. But in detention, you get to sit in a room by yourself and the food's brought to you. Oh no, the horror. The next step up, isolation. Instead of having to listen to all the innate prattle of trying to listen to the teacher, but listen to some boys talk about which girl they're interested in, and the girls talking about which car they're going to get, and all this innate drivel and blah, I have to sit in a room by myself all day and have the work brought to me. Oh, the horror. Sorry, I'm trying to act a bit. And my drama teacher said I was rubbish. The next one was the unintended consequences. This kind of comes into what was mentioned with the asking questions, perhaps where it shouldn't have been. During my university days, there was various issues where I was that kind of student rep. I was involved with the students' union, but wouldn't stop asking questions and wouldn't stop badgering people, which ended up with major reforms to a particular subject because it turned out the lecturer was giving first year students PhD work, effectively getting them to do the research without proper consent or what's the word, compensation or disclosure. I don't know. It was a big problem, which ended up with me putting together a little, I think it was 70 or 80 page report, which the admin kind of gawked at and then said, "Oh, thank you." Next, I'm gonna have to take a big L for this, and that for younger people, it basically means I made a bit of a boo-boo, and you're all gonna have a nice laugh at me. So you look at this sign, you see them all over the place for parking spaces. It says 1 hour, which is the length of time you can leave your car. No return within 1 hour. Now, me, freshly passing my driving test in 2011, I think that's going to be hard to do. So I've got to leave my car, and I can't come back to my car for an hour, which led me going to a car park and standing near my car for about 20 minutes until somebody came out and said, "Oi, mate, why are you stalking this person's car? I'm going to call the police." To which I then had to explain it's my car. And then they had to explain to me that I was a bit of an idiot because that didn't mean that you couldn't physically return to your car within an hour. It meant once you've left, you can't park back within an hour. Anyway, yeah, so yeah, just yeah, parking. Am I right? So this, I'm going to stop the recording a bit now. I've got a thing for my email and a QR code for LinkedIn if anybody wants to link in after this. What I would say, I'll repeat again, in that there is no such thing as a daft question. There's no such thing as a